Hi, good morning. Tom's Gauntlet with you again, as usual, from Rhythm's Riddle. I wanted to today just bring up a brief point about the Renaissance and what it was. I'm not a scholar in the official sense. I'm a scholar. Like a lay scholar, like what they call a scholar that basically just as potent as any other scholar, but I don't. Well, I guess what the internet has allowed is that anybody can be a scholar, and you don't need direct access to a library anymore. Classically, any scholar, you need access to a really uh, deep library. And now, with the internet, we all have that. So the Renaissance, it's an interesting thing, but I'm talking about the medieval Renaissance and whether or not it was something that came from certain places. Like, was it from Venice, right? Or Florence? Or Constantinople, right? Istanbul, basically. Well, I tend to think that yeah, it may have easily. Well, you can easily point to places and say it generated out of certain places, but I don't agree. I think that it dates back to just the confluence of cultures throughout the Mediterranean through trade. So we're going back, 5,000 years to the Phoenicians? Something like that. 5,000, 6,000 years ago, the Phoenicians, the traders, the sea traders of the Mediterranean, well, Eastern Mediterranean, but they eventually took over the entire Mediterranean, was Phoenician, and so forth. I think. I mean, if I'm wrong, correct me, please. If you know more than me, I mean, I'm happy. I'm happy to listen to other people. So, and to be corrected or at least informed of differing ideas. But what I'm saying today, because while I'm talking about the Renaissance, I just share some poets and or some poems from a poet who I say is a Renaissance poet from, well, the 14th century. And from Shiraz. And so what a lot of people overlook is the fact that I really believe the Renaissance came from the Muslim world. And that it sort of was the European Renaissance as we know it was the manifestation of imbibed cultural influence of the Muslims within Europe. And so, because remember, the Library of Alexandria burned down in I don't know, what, the 1st or 2nd century, something like that. That was Europe's conduit into everything scholarly. All classical scholarship was in the library, and apparently everything burned down. So all was lost. But there were Muslim libraries in the Middle East and North Africa or West Africa, that survived and that did not inform all of Europe. So we have Europe falling into a dark ages, and yet nobody really knows. They try to point to the plague as the beginning of the dark age, and that might be a beginning of it, but it was primarily, or that might have to do with it, but it was primarily a lack of scholarship. They didn't have Plato or Aristotle any longer, and they didn't have these things. And then once they opened up again, there was further Renaissance. And so I believe that the Renaissance came from places outside of, well, I think the place inside Europe, I think there was a Granada Renaissance, because Granada was the seat of the capital of the, I forget, they call them Moors in Spain, but I think maybe it was the Moorish caliphate or something, or kingdom. So again, correct me if it agitates you to hear someone like, not exactly correct. And there are people like that. It's like, they can't stand, like those people, if you pronounce something slightly different than how they're used to, even though they know, at least they presume they know what you were trying to say, which is the point, right? Like, so instead of discarding the husk of the word and going with the flow of the thought being communicated, they break up the thought and trip over the difference in pronunciation. No, we say tomato, and then some people will just insist that you correct yourself before you go on. It's to these people that I inevitably have to bid adieu and, moon, basically. Have to show my butt and walk away. That's, unfortunately, I'm not going to be able to show too much respect for people who just want to trip up. They're not interested in ideas. They're just interested in getting tripped up over small facts. So anyways, the general idea, what I'm saying here today, is that, well, Shiraz, Isfahan, these cities in Iran were a real source for the Renaissance. And I shared the poet Hafiz, and I claim he's from the Renaissance. He's a Renaissance poet. And why do I claim that? Well, look at what the Renaissance was. Everyone who was anybody in the Renaissance knew Hafiz, Da Vinci, you go on and on, Raphael, all these different writers and poets, Thoreau, right? Everyone loved Hafiz. I mean, I know Thoreau wasn't Renaissance, but you go back continually and continually. Hafiz has continued to inspire poets, artists, musicians, and thinkers since his time. How many thinkers are there like that? That to me, that's Renaissance. That's Renaissance, and that's the beginning of Renaissance. Like within what Hafiz says, although he's not particularly saying it, but you get gleams and flashes of his philosophy within the poetry. He is such a vast thinker and a master communicator. And oftentimes, as a reader, we will laugh. We will break out in laughter. And his poems are short. They're beautiful. They're just little impromptu sort of paragraphs. That's what they are. Beautiful. That's how I love poetry, when it can be distilled down to its essence and not. I like poetry too with a lot of baggage. We have to discern the difference between literature and poetry, and that's difficult. I believe poetry is concise. That's the point. Poetry that gets bogged down in too much language. I mean, it can be extensive. I'm not saying poetry can't be extensive or can't be in epic verse or anything. Of course it can. There actually are no rules to poetry. Seriously. No rules. Just you and your pen and whatever the divine imagination can concoct. That's poetry. But so I'm not going to say something isn't poetry. I'm saying my most cherished and prized poetry, what I love the most, is concise. Rumi, Hafiz, and there's a reason. It's far more universal. Edward Dorn is probably more difficult to translate. And so too would be like Gary Snyder, more difficult to translate. These types of things, the people. Of course, they're modern. I'm not talking about medieval poets. I mean, how many do I know? I guess I don't know too many. It's a good thing that Hafiz has stuck around. Well, there's Shakespeare, of course, definitely a Renaissance poet of a couple hundred years after Hafiz. Shakespeare would have been definitely a fan of Hafiz. And so that's the extent of the impact of Hafiz. And so also what I'm saying is, well, how did Hafiz get there? I think probably Hafiz came to Europe through Granada. That's it, through Granada. And then later through Cordoba, which was the second capital. But Granada was and still has always been a node of Renaissance thinking. And even today, I've been there, its medieval character is well preserved, and the balance of modern life and its medieval character is it's epic, it's beautiful, it's a lovely city in every way. There are many cities like this in Spain, like medieval style cities. Nonetheless, Granada has its unique character, its personality. And I believe that comes from its history as a center of culture and thinking and scholarship. And so the dissemination of these books through Spain, through Andalusia, through Granada and Cordoba, I think this is where it began. This is really where the Renaissance began, because for 1,000 years, without those books, without access to the history, it left Europe, not all parts of Europe. I'm not going to claim all Europe is just all clunked together. There were pockets of Renaissance thinking all along throughout Europe since the Phoenicians. Notably in Ireland, but other places as well. Ireland was like the Book of Kells, what we have from there. It's amazing. And then now we look at, it takes a long time for people to realize this. What Finnegan's Wake really is. What is it? It's not a novel. It's not gibberish. It's a Bible. That's what it is. It's a Bible. It's the fairies. It's the Bible of Elfin, of fairyland. Yeah, it's the Bible of fairyland. And so it is the second book of Kells, you could say. It's the reincarnation of every holy book. That's what Joyce did. It's the Old Testament, definitely. It's the New Testament. It's the resurrection. It's prophecy. I'm not going to go so far as compare it to the Quran, because I don't know much about the Quran, and so it wouldn't make sense. But I wouldn't be surprised if the whole outline of the Quran, it somehow isn't encapsulated in it. That's all I'm saying, is I wouldn't be surprised, because James Joyce was such a universal scholar in every way. He knew more than anybody. That's why it's not a book you can approach alone. It's not a book you read alone and appreciate. That's not the kind of thinker Joyce was. It's a kind of book that Joyce was so far ahead of all of us. I mean, look, he wrote the Elfin Bible. Who could do that? It's a night book. It's a pure night book. It's almost impossible to approach. If you approach it alone, it will just be gibberish, and then that true Renaissance Shakespearean beauty within every line will be lost to you because because what it takes is we need teams of people. We have to go and hear what other people have learned from it and what other people say about it. And this will help us enormously. So in that way, Terence McKenna was right. It's the most Talmudic book. And I really think that the continuation of the Renaissance right now, that it isn't something that has stopped and was limited to a particular period. I think within architecture, you can certainly, try and do that. But then nonetheless, architectural styles have nonetheless stayed open. The Renaissance didn't end. Look at Antoni Gaudi as recently as 100 years ago. Antoni Gaudi was building buildings in a style you can only coin, well, not you can only coin, but would best be coined neo-Renaissance. Neo-Renaissance. That was Antoni Gaudi, because he incorporated Byzantine, Gothic, High Gothic, Romantic, modern ideas. His buildings were so alive. Like, look at the castle that he built for. I forget. He built a castle for someone. Gaudi's castle. It's such a feat of pure beauty and sophistication in every way. Like all we can do is learn from Gaudi, and yet all the West has done is forget about him. All right, like the whole 20th century was in the United States was a rush away from even thinking about Gaudi or appreciating him or appreciating the continual Renaissance, which has been ongoing. It didn't stop. If you look at it too academically, you're going to pinpoint it to one place and one time. It didn't come from one place. It came from many places. It's not just from Shiraz or Isfahan or Venice or Florence or from Cordoba or Dublin. It's not just something from one place. It's not just from Egypt, from Cairo. Seriously, Cairo has been and still is one of the most diverse and Renaissance-inspired cities in the world. It's like very musically diverse. They're very open to ideas. We don't understand it at all. The whole U.S. psychology has been one of this fierce, independent thinking in a lot of ways, like claiming itself to just have its own point of view fiercely, and at the face and at the cost even of not even opening ourselves up or listening to other points of view. That's been a bit of the problem, and that's what prevents Renaissance. Renaissance comes about from cultural openness. That's where Renaissance feeds Renaissance ideas within art, within literature, and especially within music and playwriting, because playwriting uses music. But Nietzsche was completely on target about the use of music to tell stories, that it's a demotion of music. It's a demeaning of the true dignity of music to exclusively and constantly bind it down just to a particular story, a particular opera, say, opera, of course, it's beautiful. It's because the music transcends the words in the end. And then also it has very beautiful words. But like opera is the Holy Grail. Opera is the continuation of the troubadours, the philosophy of the troubadours, like beautiful singing. But nonetheless, you can trace that back all the way to India. Hindustani music, that's really what it's all about. And even nowadays, you can see it within Hindustani music and other styles of music, Sufi music, Sikh music, which is called Guru Bandi. Guru Bandi is, Guru Bani. Guru Bani is a style of music. Yeah, there are words, but the words are so beautiful and transcendent. They are sacred, divine verses. That's what they are. So Christians who haven't woken up to Sikhs, to the truth within Sikhism, are basically living in the dark ages, like self-afflicted, because there's no need to. Turns out Sikhism is for all. Just like Christians say Christianity is for all. Well, even more so, Sikhism is for all. In fact, Sikhism, if you look into it and study its history and evolution, and then their teachings, we see that Sikhism is the most Christian of religions nowadays. It's more Christian than Christianity is. Nowadays, Christianity has turned into this, at almost any church, it's turned into this thing where it's just about these sort of symbolic rituals. It's this like highly ritualistic religion. And it's alienated from the true effect of living. No, I mean, more or less. I mean, of course, there's charity and Christian charity, and that's a big thing. That's a real thing. I mean, Christianity is still a good thing too, but there's Sikh charity. So I'm just saying that the Sikhism imbibes all of the values of Christianity. And if Christians want to ignore that and close their eyes to that, it's to their detriment. It's to their detriment. Just as, Sikhs can close their eyes to other cultures as well. Plenty of closed-minded Sikhs. I'm not saying that just to be Sikh is to be perfect either. That's the thing. You can't just stake your flag one place and think you're saved. That's not what it's about. We have to remain open and to learning from other people who are even different from us. That's what it's all about, being open. And so just as many closed-minded Sikhs, maybe even more, Sikhs are not a very open-minded group. I've been around them a lot. They're very loving, very nice people, but so are most people from anywhere, Japan, China, like India, other parts of India, or Pakistan, or Afghanistan, go over to Europe. It's like the same thing. France, Germany, Holland, Poland, everyone's really nice. People are good people everywhere. I believe in a lot of the tenets of Buddhism. And Buddhism says that people are essentially good. And so, like, our spiritual ideas and thinkings are not so different from each other as we pretend they are. Sikhism is not so different, and they have hymns too, right? Christians have their own hymns. They lag, right? Christian music generally lags. I mean, there's good Christian music definitely out there, but as a whole, it generally doesn't aspire to very much. Of course, the choirs are different. Choirs are something completely transcendent right there. You get into, right, there's good and bad choir music, but just the whole philosophy of choirs, right? Well, there's worship right there. That's artistic worship. That's Renaissance thinking, if you ask me. Because everything else seems to be trying to pull us away from the canvas and the paper, pull us away from writing, from singing, from our musical instruments, to pull us away from our drums and our cymbals. Everything else is trying to pull us away from that. Say, no, watch this video, read this book. Well, reading a book is art, so you're participating in something. But just as you are when you're listening to music and looking at art, but we should we should appreciate art, and in that way, with the overall aim of becoming better artists ourselves. That's what we all are. Those people out there who shun people like me for claiming that everyone's an artist, and they say, no, 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 no. Like even Peterson, I highly esteem Peterson, but he seems to think that it's impossible that everyone's not an artist. And I think that actually that's not true at all. In fact, everyone has an artist within them. Some of us just have it more, kicked out of us, either literally or metaphorically, right? It will figuratively, whatever. By the time some people grow up, they are so anti-artistic that it leads other people to think that, well, it's just a matter of biology, that everyone's not meant to be an artist. But I disagree. I think that the truth is there's an art for everybody. Right? I think almost everybody is meant to draw. We're all meant to be drawers and painters. I really do. I think almost everybody is. But of course, not everybody, but I think everyone can cultivate or almost everybody can cultivate that as a tool, as a psychological tool, which it is, right? Like you look back to the caves of Lascaux and those other caves that were there in France from like 40,000 years ago. These paintings are some of the oldest paintings in the world, and they are more beautiful renderings of animals than has ever been painted, because their relationship with them was more tactile. It was more real. Since then, now we're in history. Our eye is different, right? I'll try to link back up the talk I gave about that, about the evolution of the eye, the evolving artistic vision through the ages. It's an amazing talk, sort of similar to what I'm talking about here. Not really about the Renaissance, but just about how the eye, the notion of the eye has changed over the millennia. And nowadays, no matter what, like even Raphael or some of the greatest painters wouldn't, like, no matter how perfect looking their animals could be, they don't even come close to the perfection that was achieved by those Paleolithic cave painters in France, painting the horses, lions, mammoths, buffalo, all kinds of animals. It's just like all of the animals that were painted there. It can never be copied. We don't have that eye anymore. We don't have that relationship to the savannah. We're not the same people. Art changes as we change through history, and it affects our hands because our hands and fingers are integrally connected to our minds. In fact, that's what our minds have built themselves up upon. Our minds are creepers that have built history upon the tendrils of our fingers. And so the Renaissance is even within Antoni Gaudi, and it was carried through. There seemed to be fewer and fewer people. There's more and more people like, Adolf Loos, right? The absolute death of art within architecture. And then that whole idea, the utilitarian style of Adolf Loos from, 100 years ago, it has carried over and been continued practically. I mean, of course, there's rebelling in its own way, like stylistic rebelling, but it's... And that's an interesting thing. I'm not here to talk about art history so much, but yet the Renaissance has continued, and it continues. Like, who continued it after Gaudi? I think notably Friedensreich Hundertwasser, who was a painter. He wasn't an architect, but he did build a couple houses, incidentally, as I could, in a similar spirit. I could easily build. So Hundertwasser, probably 50 years ago, he built a house, I think in the 60s or 70s. He built one in Napa. It's nothing as epic or grandiose as Gaudi could do. Gaudi was a true facilitator of talent. He was able to harness the talent of all of the artisans and creative people around him and utilize all of their efforts to good effect. Whereas in Napa, I don't think Hundertwasser had so much of that at his disposal. I think that kind of facilitation was difficult because, most of the artisans were probably just, sculpting redwood or something and not really doing very much. And so I'm sure some were there, but for whatever reason, and he did utilize some, he had to utilize some artisans to create what he did. I'm just trying to account for the reason why it's not as grandiose. Well, as some of the houses, like Gaudi designed houses, some of his houses, which were just astoundingly beautiful and a mixture of different styles all at once. And Gaudi went all the way. He created the insides, everything down to the chandelier and every single window, original windows that would invite you to look out of or in. Like those are the kind of windows you would just flock to as you explore a house, right? It's that love of being inside of a new building and climbing up stairs and exploring all around, even to the point where he designed all of the furniture in the house too to go along with it, and his chimneys and the way he engineered heat to be created within the house, within a specific place of a fireplace to preserve the heat throughout the house. Gaudi was way ahead of his time. And so, which goes to say, but he was also way before his time. He's just a Renaissance thinker. He's timeless. That's the point. It's not being ahead or before. It's just being in timelessness. And it hasn't seemed to be that style of timelessness has been lost to much of the West, and especially much of America. But England is suffering very badly. England is a very ugly place. But then again, it's got more beauty in that it has more tradition. I guess everywhere. Like, what do you have in the U.S.? You have tradition, but it basically only goes back to, well, you have some things that are pretty old, a couple hundred years old, but otherwise it goes back 100 years, Victorian style, right? The rise of the new Victorian or the classical Victorian. So for whatever reason, I don't find Victorian is not Renaissance. Victorian is a kind of very conservative, bland kind of style that incorporates some sort of stylistic elements within itself, right? It's better than the utilitarian style, much better. But nonetheless, it's getting there. It's well on its way to being just completely utilitarian, and so the Renaissance has been around us, I think, and I think it's still here. I don't know. I can't name an architect today who's there. I think that the architects are the individuals. They're just like lone people off somewhere, or some lone family off somewhere that builds a tree house with just grandiose, imaginative abilities. Just build something out of their imagination that's entirely beautiful, or builds a tower, right? Like, that's all it takes. Build a tower and make beautiful windows inside it, and then put a little beautiful terrace at the top, so you can enjoy the view and the sun and whatnot. That's how we should be building. So, Renaissance, to end this talk on the Renaissance, I'm going to end it on this note, on talking about roofs, to say, well, if there was any sort of Renaissance thinking going on in the architecture in California, you would see, it would be apparent in that they would build something with rooftops, right? What a place. You look at a place like Kathmandu, everyone builds on the roofs in Kathmandu. There's terraces everywhere. And yet Kathmandu doesn't have much of building style anywhere. It's absolutely drowning in utilitarianism. In fact, it's not even that utilitarian. It's like it's so ramshackle. People will they'll just build up a building just out of popsicle sticks and put cement around it just to have the facade of structure so they can start selling stuff at the top on the roof. And yet, like, the next earthquake comes around and bam, it's absolute rubble. That's how everyone's building. They don't realize it. They're not building for permanent. They're like, everyone is in such a predicament in Nepal. Poverty is so vast in Nepal that people build for the short term. That's all that they can think of, really, is like the absolute short term, trying to put food on the table for the next week. Can they do it? And that's a struggle. And so to do that and get shelter for tonight, that's a struggle. So you see all sorts of cheap, fast solutions everywhere. In the countryside, people just digging and putting little tin roofs in a mud hillside, right? And then big rains come and then there's massive mudslides and thousands of villages every year get ruined in Nepal. Thousands every year, right? It's massive how many different villages get swept away year after year after year after year. And it's so commonplace that it's not even mentioned in news or travel or anything. And so Nepal is a dangerous place, particularly because nobody is thinking for the long-term future, or few people. Some people are. Right? I mean, it has some infrastructure, but most of it is very short-term and ramshackle. Nonetheless, they realize the validity of the sunshine and what attracts people, and having a nice rooftop terrace is one of the nicest things to do, to sit in the shade or in the sun on a warm or hot day and soak in the rays and read a book or sip lemonade. And put a garden too. There's so many people that decorate their rooftops in Nepal with beautiful gardens. And that's all I'm saying. So I'm ending it on this note. If there was any Renaissance in California, it would be immediately noticed that everything that was being built would, of course, they would be utilizing the rooftops too, and building things for people to go up on the rooftops and sit and lie down and look around and whatnot. And it would be the key place. It would be almost the place you wouldn't want to lose out on, that extra space that you had up there. You built the whole house, and then like the very pinnacle and best part of it, they forget. And not only that, when you fly into these countries like US or Canada or the UK, or a lot of Europe, you fly into these countries, it's really sad, because you look down at the rooftops, the roofs are the ugliest parts of the building. Gaudi wasn't like that at all. So Gaudi was true Renaissance. We're not living in a Renaissance here. Nonetheless, I believe the Renaissance has been ongoing. It's just a matter of interest, right? Those people who are interested in Ton's Gauntlet and interested in Antoni Gaudi and interested in Gary Schneider, and Thomas Merton, and interested in all art throughout history. It's like the very interest in art throughout history is the Renaissance. Like, not being interested in that. That's all I'm saying. Like, we don't live in a culture that's very interested in art and art history and art throughout history, not just art history, which sounds boring. It's not boring. It's art throughout history, right? There's no official way to approach it. You can approach it any way you want. You don't have to learn everything before you can know anything. It's not like that at all. You can just know anything and then use that as a platform for delving further. That's all it takes. So all it takes is the interest and the passion to want to stay interested. That's all it takes. That's what the Renaissance is. It's passion, and the passion to stay interested. Thanks for joining me at Rhythms Riddle. Please, I appreciate it. If you can like and subscribe and like, I do appreciate that. And check out my playlists.